When we're asked to think about the nature of law, most of us today, I think, would tend to think about things pertaining to courts and judges and police officers enforcing the law. But for Aquinas, and indeed for medieval philosophers, the nature of law, the notion of law, is a bit more expansive than that. Law includes not only issues in social and political discussions, but also theological ones and moral ones. So what I want to talk about today is I want to take a look at Aquinas' general account of law, and in particular his account of the natural law. And I want to talk in general about his, I want to say, two-track system of ethics, which includes sort of the natural law track, but also the divine law track. And so what you should have in front of you is you should have the notes that I'm calling St. Thomas Aquinas on law, but also this chart, this handout that I gave on the natural law and the divine law in Thomas Aquinas. And you should also have your textbook, because I want to read from something from question 94 on the natural law. So maybe the first thing I want to talk about is, according to Aquinas, there are four kinds of law: the eternal law, the natural law, the human law, and the divine law. The eternal law, this is God's plan for the universe, also known as providence. It is God's plan as it is known to himself. The natural law is God's plan for human beings, in particular known to us through our natural capacities, through our reason, and through our natural inclinations. Natural law is based on the eternal law. It is how we come to know the eternal law, through our own means, through our natural reason and our natural inclinations. It's how we can know what God's will is, through our own natural abilities. Human laws are ideally reflections of God's plan for human beings as known through natural law, designed to fit particular societal functions and enforced by those human beings who have the right to enforce them. So far we have is the eternal law, God's plan as it is known to himself; natural law, which is God's plan as human beings can know it through their natural reason and natural inclinations; and we have human law, which is how human beings apply the natural law to particular times and places to make the sorts of laws and enforce the sorts of laws that we ordinarily think about when we think of law. And so usually our modern conception of law falls just under the human law aspect. We tend not to often think about laws with respect to how God thinks about things and what we can know through our natural reason. But so far we've got these three: the eternal law, which is God's plan for the universe as it is known to himself; the natural law, which is God's plan for human beings in particular, which is known through our own natural abilities, natural reason, and natural inclinations; and human law, which is how human beings ideally adapt or apply the natural law to particular societies and cultures. Now, the one natural law is not going to dictate the same human laws in all circumstances, because even when you look at the natural law, Aquinas says, this isn't going to spell out exactly in all details what sort of laws you should have in particular times and places, because of geographical differences, because of size differences, because of some particular cultural differences. Human laws might be different across different societies or governments, all of which could still be tied to and based on the natural law. The last kind of law is the divine law. The divine law are particular features of God's design for human beings known through revelation. So one of the ways to understand this is that the eternal law is God's plan as he knows it to himself. The natural law is how we know God's plan through our natural abilities, through natural reason and natural inclinations. And divine law is how we come to know God's law, God's design, God's plan through revelation. And there are two principal sources of revelation as Aquinas breaks it down. There is the Old Law, which are the features of the divine law revealed through the Old Testament, and there is the New Law, which are the features of the divine law revealed through the New Testament. So he divides the divine law into two: the Old, which is based on the Old Testament, and the New, which is based on the New Testament. So the eternal law, and there is what God's will is, and there are two ways for us to know it: through our natural abilities, that's the natural law, our natural reason, our natural inclinations, and through revelation. And this is divine law, which can come in the form of maybe personal revelation, but especially revelation through the tradition. Okay, so how is the natural law then related to the eternal law? Once again, it is how God's plan is known through our own natural abilities. And what we get in natural law is a series of precepts or rules. We can, just by reasoning or properly identifying our own natural inclinations, come to understand what is morally good or what is morally bad in the background, right? What's making it, in the strong sense, morally bad or morally good is that this is God's plan as revealed through our natural reason and our natural inclinations. So now I want to talk then about some of the details about natural law. What are these precepts? What are these rules? How could we use our reason or identifying our natural inclinations to determine what sorts of things are morally wrong and morally right? Well, the two things I want to say and set up before we go into the details about the particular rules or precepts of the natural law. There are two ways to get at naturally what is morally bad or morally good. In general, right, Aquinas has in the background, right, that morality. He's getting this from Aristotle as well. It gets encapsulated in the Christian philosophical tradition. The idea that the ultimate goal of morality, the ultimate motivation you have for doing the right thing, is that it contributes to your own true happiness. So why be a good person? Because you'll be happier that way. And why not do morally bad things? Because you'll be more unhappy, right? You will be miserable if you do the right sorts of bad things, right? If you do certain sorts of bad things. So what we're doing when we look into the natural law then is we're trying to get a sense of what happiness is for human beings. And once you identify what happiness is for human beings, maybe you can break it down into some particular components. And maybe what you'll see is that, oh, okay, well, if those are necessary components for happiness, then any action that destroyed or undermined those particular components of happiness would have to be morally bad. And any actions that encourage or bring about some of those key ingredients to happiness, those things would be morally good. The other way you can look at it is you can sort of look at happiness as a whole and you can break it down to its key ingredients. The way that Aquinas seems to do it in question 94 is he looks at our sort of deep-seated desires or inclinations or abilities, I guess you could say, right? To try to identify, well, what are the deep desires, inclinations, capacities that we have as the sorts of creatures that we are. And so it should be good to help exercise those or realize those, and it should be bad to thwart or undermine those deep natural desires or inclinations. So let me run through how he's actually going to do this in some of the details. So here's what I want to read something from the text because it's really dense, but really important to read what he actually says about this. So I want to look at question 94, article 2 in his reply. If you have your book, this is on page 531, and I'm on the second column towards the bottom half of the second column on 531. He says, towards the bottom of page 531 in the second column, the first principle and practical reason is one based on the nature of good, namely that good is what all things seek. Therefore, the first precept of the natural law is that we should do good and do and seek good and shun evil. And all the other precepts of the natural law are based on that precept, namely that all the things that practical reason by nature understands to be human goods or evils belong to precepts of the natural law as things to be done or shunned. So the primary ethical principle here on how you should guide your actions is that you should seek or pursue those natural goods, and you should avoid or shun any of the natural bads, or you should avoid any actions that undermine those natural goods. But what are these natural goods? How do we figure out what the natural goods are? Here he gives, I said there are two approaches. You can take happiness and you can break it down into its key ingredients. Here he seems to look at sort of our natural inclinations to help us figure out what these natural goods are. He says, and since good has the nature of end and evil the nature of the contrary, reason by nature understands to be good all the things for which human beings have a natural inclination. and so to be things to be actively sought, and understands contrary things as evil and to be shunned. Therefore, the ordination of our natural inclinations ordains the precepts of the natural law. And now we're going to get some examples. First, for example, human beings have an inclination for good by the nature they share with all substances, namely, as every substance by nature seeks to preserve itself. And regarding this inclination means that preserve our human life and prevent the contrary belong to the natural law. Second, human beings have more particular inclinations by the nature they share with other animals. And so the Digest says that things that nature has taught all animals, such as the sexual union of male and female, and the upbringing of children, and the like, belong to the natural law. Third, human beings have inclinations for good by their rational nature, which is proper to them. For example, human beings by nature have inclinations to know truth about God and to live in society with other human beings. And so things that relate to such inclinations belong to the natural law. For example, that human beings shun ignorance, that they not offend those with whom they ought to live sociably, and other such things regarding those inclinations. So packed in all of that are a whole bunch of particular natural goods, and as a result, where we're going to get our particular rules or precepts within the natural law. He first identifies various precepts based on an inclination shared by all substances. He says, those pertaining to the preservation of one's own life and the resistance of those things that threaten it. And so what you're going to get are some particular moral rules, right, that it would be morally wrong to end one's own life. It would be morally wrong to damage oneself. We have this natural inclination for self-preservation and sort of health and well-being of ourselves. So anything that would undermine that would be morally wrong. Secondly, he identifies various precepts based on inclinations shared by all animals. He says those pertaining to the preservation of one's species and the resistance of those things that threaten it. So here identifies a couple of natural goods that we share with other creatures, the natural good of procreation and the care and education of offspring. What that means is that it's going to be morally right to pursue any of those things in the right circumstances. And it's going to be morally wrong any action that undermines or violates those basic goods. The third category is precepts based on inclinations shared by all beings of a rational nature, those pertaining to the search for knowledge of God, and those pertaining to the cooperation of human beings in society. Right? So we enlist here shunning ignorance and not offending those with whom one has to live. So it identifies that there are some particular features of us as human beings that we can find or see some natural goods or natural inclinations. So there are two ways to get at what a human being is. On the one hand, we are rational animals. We are animals of a particular sort, but what makes us unique is our rationality. And so because we have this natural inclination, this natural ability of rationality, we have this natural inclination for greater knowledge, for wisdom. And so any actions that undermine our quest for knowledge are bad, and any of those that encourage, that help us develop to come to the truth, those are going to be morally good. But also he wants to pack in a whole bunch of other stuff with respect to the other way of getting at our nature, that not only are we rational animals, we are political animals, as Aristotle says, or we are social creatures. What that means is that naturally we do better. We require community with other people. One of the things that you'll notice as we're sort of in lockdown here is it feels like something is missing in our lives. And what's missing are the communal aspects, the social aspects that Aquinas and Aristotle think is sort of built into our nature. And so you're going to find all sorts of particular goods that stem from that community. So generally any action that undermines your ability to live well in community with others is going to be morally wrong, and any actions that help you to live better with other people is going to be morally good. So here we're going to pack in things like, well, killing other people is bad because that's going to undermine the community. Stealing from other people, that's going to undermine the community. Lying to other people, that's going to undermine the community. Whereas helping those in need and telling the truth and engaging in various social groups, these are going to be natural goods, and so doing those things is going to be morally good. Now, we might have questions about how successful this project is of coming up with a system of morality just based on a conception of human happiness that can be understood through reason or by looking at our natural inclinations. But this is what Aquinas is trying to do in this part of the Summa. He's trying to build up a kind of natural morality through the natural law. He's trying to set up a whole list of do's and don'ts based on what reason and our natural inclinations can tell us about what God's will is. Now, there are some further questions here about, well, if it's done solely by means of reason, right, do we need to bring in God's will at all? Can't we just reason about what our natural inclinations are or about what human happiness is, sort of separate from what God's will is, and we can build morality, sort of completely secular morality, just based on that? Some proponents of natural law think that yes, we can do that because it's just based on a reason and not based on revelation. It ought to be able to be done outside of any particular religious context. Other people think that no, it's really important to understand the deeper role that God's will is playing in all of this. I don't know. There are a lot of interesting debates both throughout the history and in contemporary discussions about natural law about which way we should go on that. The other thing worth mentioning here is that what Aquinas is trying to determine with all of these rules, right? Recall his earlier distinction between the parts of a moral act. We've got the object, the circumstances, and the end. What he's identifying here is what would make an object morally good or morally bad. Remember, that's only one part of assessing whether someone has done the right thing or the wrong thing. What he's just giving us is a framework for how to determine whether the object, what someone is doing, the kind of thing that they're doing, whether it is wrong or right, whether it is in accordance with some basic human goods, or whether it is conflict with some of them. We'd also have to, in order to figure out in any particular circumstance whether someone did the right thing, we'd also have to determine the circumstances in which they performed that generally good thing, and also the end for which they performed that particular thing. Maybe one last thing about the natural law before I go over to the chart, the handout, which gives a larger overview of Aquinas' larger ethical project, is the relationship between the natural law and the divine law. So in general, right, the natural law is how we know about morality through reason. The divine law is how we know about morality through revelation. But there's an interesting area of overlap, and this is in the domain of the old divine law. So, for example, in the Old Testament, the Ten Commandments. What Aquinas says is that the Ten Commandments can themselves be discovered or determined by human beings in both ways. You can figure out, right, that killing, that stealing, right, that adultery is wrong by means of reason. You wouldn't need the special revelation. You wouldn't need the tablets in order to know those things. Or you can know them through revelation. It's this interesting crossover here. Maybe there are some things, right, that reason, maybe only reason can show you about what's morally wrong or right. There are some things that only revelation perhaps can tell you about what is morally wrong or right. But there's this interesting overlap at the Old Testament, specifically the Ten Commandments, where you can determine them both by reason and by revelation. So what the discussion of the natural law and the divine law introduces is this larger series of questions about, well, what is the bigger relationship between the natural and the divine law? And here I want to take a look at this handout, this chart that I gave you, called a comparison between the natural law and divine law in the Ethics of Thomas Aquinas. If you look at this chart, you'll notice that what I've got are actually two rows. They're actually two sort of streams, you might call them, in Aquinas' ethics. There's the natural stream and there's the supernatural stream, or as I've called them here, the natural law stream and the new divine law stream. I've focused on the new divine law here because the Old Testament, the old divine law, we saw as an interesting area of crossover. So I've identified this natural stream and this supernatural stream, and I have identified the various differences along this stream. Differences in the source of moral knowledge on each of these streams, the source of moral action, the resultant state of moral action, the goal or the end of moral action, the resultant state of immoral action, and the end result of immoral action. So if you're following along in the chart, I'll read through it and explain some of it. On the Aquinas' natural stream, right, how we sort of the aspect of morality that is through the reason side, right? How do we come to know what is morally wrong or morally right? Here, the source of moral knowledge is human reason or our natural inclinations. And how do we perform the right sorts of actions? By our own will, by our own habituation, through our own natural means. And what happens when we do habituate or perform the right sorts of actions, which we determine by reason and use our will to perform? You can use these to get the acquired virtues. What are the acquired virtues? The acquired virtues are the habits that you can put in yourself through your own natural means. They're the sorts of virtues that Aristotle was talking about. Now, what's the ultimate goal? Why use your reason and your will to get various acquired virtues? Here we are looking for human happiness, but here Aquinas distinguishes between imperfect human happiness, the kind of natural human happiness that we're capable of in this life, and perfect human happiness, which is only possible, which we can only get in the next life. So he thinks that on the natural stream, what you can achieve is a kind of imperfect happiness. Through your reason and your will, you can develop various virtues that help you to flourish, do well, to be happy as a human being sort of in the natural world. On the other side of things, you can develop various acquired vices, and you can, when you do, you will fail to achieve imperfect happiness. He also thinks that even on the natural stream, right, performing immoral actions or developing certain acquired vices in the natural stream, which go against reason, can also prevent you from achieving perfect happiness. There's a point I want to make about that, but maybe I'll go through the supernatural stream next. So the supernatural stream, the divine law, and in particular the new law, what is the source of our knowledge? Revelation in tradition or in some other authority. And here there's also a difference in not only how we know what is morally wrong or morally right, but how it is that we actually perform morally good actions. Now it's no longer by our own natural means, but it's by means of God's grace. And what we get through God's grace are we get these various infused virtues, things that you have not inculcated or habituated in yourself, but have been freely given by God to you, not by anything that you've done to earn it, but they are gifts. And what's the goal? Why do you need God's grace and these infused virtues and to know what is right and wrong from revelation? Because this is how you achieve perfect happiness. This is how you get to heaven and enjoy the beatific vision. I think there's also maybe a sense in which by doing this you'll also achieve a kind of imperfect human happiness, but that wouldn't be the ultimate goal. Once you've got grace and infused virtues here, the ultimate goal, keep your eyes on the prize, it's not about happiness in this life, but happiness in the next. Well, what happens when you go against revelation, reject God's grace, and fail to be granted the infused virtues? The state here is not just vice, but mortal sin. And the result is that you have no access to perfect happiness, and probably no access to complete imperfect happiness either. Right? So if you go against revelation, God's grace, the infused virtues, you will prevent yourself from being able to achieve perfect human happiness. But there's also a sense in which your life is probably not going to go very well in the natural sphere either. So maybe to sum it up, right? So the natural law, the natural stream, which we can come to know what is morally wrong or morally right through our own natural abilities, through reason and our inclination. There's a certain pathway towards imperfect happiness along this chain. And then on the supernatural track, through the divine law, which we know through revelation, and which we can accomplish only through God's grace and not by our own natural means, the track here culminates in perfect human happiness. Now, if you achieve imperfect human happiness, you won't thereby achieve perfect human happiness. You cannot earn your way into heaven, though you can, through your own natural means, prevent yourself from having access to perfect human happiness. So you cannot gain entrance to heaven by your own natural means, but you can lose admission into heaven by your own natural means. Let's see, is there any other things that I should mention here about the natural stream and the supernatural stream? Well, the larger question here, right, and a lot of debates, not only in scholars of Aquinas, but also one of the running debates throughout the medieval period, is what is sort of this relationship between the natural stream and the supernatural stream. Does the supernatural stream in some sense, replace the natural stream? Is the natural stream no longer necessary now that we have the supernatural stream? Or are they both, right, in a way? Do they both contribute to the moral life of the believer? We'll see different authors emphasize different aspects to different degrees throughout the medieval period, and indeed, even in discussions going on today. So when we move forward, we'll also see Scotus's approach to this issue here. And it'll be an interesting question to see how he differs from Aquinas on these particular points, whether he's emphasizing more the natural side, or whether he's emphasizing more of the supernatural side. But that gives you a general overview of Aquinas' ethics. Last time we talked about how he breaks down the moral act in terms of the object, the circumstances, and the end, and also how he distinguishes between the interior act of the will and the external act. And here we've talked about the different kinds of law, the eternal law, the natural law, the human law, the divine law, and the two kinds of divine law. We described how Aquinas thinks that you can come into a kind of a moral system just based on reason through the natural law. And we talked about the relationship between the natural law and the ultimate goals of that stream and the divine law, the supernatural track, and the ultimate goals for that. This gives us a lot of the framework for the kind of discussions that happen after Aquinas on the nature of ethics, because it's a kind of fusion of insights from Aristotle, but also from the Christian tradition, and different medieval philosophers had different ideas about how well this fusion can actually go, and whether we actually should include as much from Aristotle as Aquinas does. But that gives you an overview, and that's the last thing that we'll discuss from Aquinas. Our next lecture is when we'll be introducing and talking about some really cool ideas from Blessed John Duns Scotus. Thanks very much.